record. Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Preemption through Procurement, our joint webinar with the UCLA Law Review. Today's webinar will begin with a brief presentation on the evolution and impact of the competition rule. And from there, we will move to a panel discussion where our esteemed panelists, who you can see on the screen right now, will discuss this, how this misinterpretation fits into broader historical and legal paradigms, as well as what a reinterpretation of the competition rule could do for local communities. After that, we'll have time for a brief Q&A, which you can submit questions to through the Q&A function. And before concluding, we'll discuss how the current notice of proposed rulemaking for the put out by the Office of Management and Budget can empower state and local governments to leverage federal investments to create good jobs, advance climate justice, and break down barriers to racial equity. But before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to Danielle Garcia, Editor-in-Chief of the UCLA Law Review, to give a few introductory remarks.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Danielle Garcia. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the UCLA Law Review. It has been my absolute pleasure to work with Professor Cummings, Madeline Janis, and the rest of the Jobs to Move America team. I definitely wanted to extend a special thank you to Melanie, who helped pull this webinar and all the details together. I was asked to briefly share a little bit about the editorial process for the UCLA Law Review. Every year we get nearly 3,000 submissions to our law review to sift through. Our articles team is tasked with that task to read and evaluate those submissions and to select a mere 15 articles for each volume. Preemption through Procurement was selected because of its relevance to current infrastructure investments and its pathway to restore state and local governments' ability to contract for the improvement of economic security and the health of workers, all while promoting climate resilience and racial justice. Once selected, the article goes through 5 rounds of editing before final production and formatting. Earlier stages include more substantive edits regarding the arguments and overall structure. Our managing team throughout the process conducts site checking to sources, which confirms the claims that are backed by the sources noted, and also ensures that they are properly site checked within the Blue Book conventions. The editorial process is truly a partnership as it unfolds over the course of a year. It was a very special publication because of the partnership specifically with Jobs to Move America. Not every article I get to work with is able to quickly and immediately outline action that administrators can pick up and run with. So with that, and without further delay, I'm going to pass this over to Madeline Janis, one of the co-authors of the article, to give a brief overview of the competition rule and key findings from the article. So thank you again. Madeline, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I think some of the underrated heroes of the legal sector in this country are the students who take on the job of editing law reviews, which really are the undergirding of jurisprudence in this country. And so we really enjoyed working with you and your team. So I'm going to present a few slides about the article's findings for about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions to our esteemed panel, beginning with my co-author and the primary lead author of this article, UCLA Law Professor Scott Cummings. So right now I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And putting this into slide view. Oops. There we go. So this article was a long time in coming, and we called it Preemption by Procurement because of the effect of federal authority federal assertion of authority over the right, the ability of state and local governments receiving federal money to actually adopt their own criteria, otherwise legal criteria, in doing purchases of goods and services. And the history of this, we have tracked to the very beginning of procurement law from the founding of this country. So I'm going to give a brief overview of that, and then we'll go deeper. And then we will have some time for questions. So how did this issue of federal authority over cities and states and what we call the competition rule come to our attention? And the story really goes back to 2012, when Jobs to Move America was working with the LA County Transportation Authority to try to get federal approval for a local hire rule and some innovative jobs language to be attached to the $1 billion purchase of rail cars and a massive expansion of the public transit system in Los Angeles and the construction part of that. And it seemed to me as a lawyer, when we were working with LA Metro, that their inability to get approval from the US DOT didn't make sense based on my reading of the law. So I actually went to the DOT and tried to understand this, and very, very lovely, nice people during the Obama administration, but the answer was an emphatic no. This cannot be done. This will potentially burden competition. And what does that mean? And really that led us to this question of what rights do state and local governments have to set their own rules, otherwise legal rules, when federal funds are involved? And the answer to that question appeared to be, and essentially was, that federal agencies have an almost unlimited right to say no to otherwise legal criteria. That began a many-year-long process of trying to dig to the source of this problem. And it came in that process of digging through led us to the Reagan Presidential Library, to looking at case law and legislative history from the very beginning of the formation of this country on what the word competition has meant in federal law and how it was radically changed and, we believe, misinterpreted in the 1980s. So here is a brief history of the evolution of what we call the competition rule. And I'm going to ask Professor Cummings a little bit more in particular about the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel rulings that led to this misinterpretation. But briefly, our research showed that the original idea of competition came from the earliest statutes in the beginning of the United States, where the idea of competition was simply about stopping collusion, stopping backroom deals, favoritism, through a transparent and open bidding process where there could be fairness and the ability to catch corruption. And that was really the reigning idea of competition. Its procedures, its openness, its fairness, up through the 1980s, including the adoption of what we look at in very great detail, the Federal Aid Highways Act of 1956, which at that time was the largest investment in infrastructure in US history. That was later amended in 1968 and 1982, a particular section of that act, but still continued the historic definition of competition as really about the method of procurement, whether it's sole source, whether it's a low price, whether it's competitive proposals. Really, the role of the federal government was to make sure that the procedures, the methods, were fair and open. And then we have what was kind of the earthquake in the definition of competition, which was a 1986 Office of Legal Counsel which is part of the Justice Department, opinion on a New York City anti-apartheid law that actually gave extra points to companies that were not invested, were not doing business with the government, the apartheid, very racist government of South Africa. And in the case of New York City, there was a long history, which we detail in the report, in the article, of the Reagan administration trying to find ways to stop about 100 cities from adopting these, what were known as sanctions laws. And this opinion held, simply without a deep dive into the statutory history of the Highways Act, into an opinion that said that the purpose of competition in federal law is simply to maximize the number of bidders and to keep the price low. This efficiency rationale, which hopefully our panel is going to talk about, that pervaded a lot of other areas of the law. That was then infused throughout the Department of Transportation and through grant rules to other parts of the federal government. There were attempts to challenge this because there were numerous cities that tried to adopt things like local hire or pay-to-play requirements or domestic partner requirements. And they were continuously told no, that they were risking their federal funds if they did it. The only major published case that took this question on was a Sixth Circuit case in 2007, the city of Cleveland versus Ohio. And the court majority found in dicta that, in fact, in their reading of the Highways Act, the federal government does not have the authority to override otherwise legal local policy. Unfortunately for the city of Cleveland, they had made other mistakes, procedural mistakes, so they lost that case. So that continued on, but a lot of confusion, a lot of fear amongst agencies that they would risk their federal funds if they adopted additional criteria. That confusion led to another 2013 Office of Legal Counsel opinion that really didn't change much. The opinion found that the 1986 opinion did not have a legal basis. However, they also found that the federal government can override local substantive criteria versus procedural criteria if there is a quote unquote undue burden on the bid pool. And this was kept very hypothetical and theoretical. Undue burden came from no case that we could find. It was a wholly constructed concept in this OLC opinion. And that has led to the current situation where the modern competition rule in grant-funded procurement, federal grant-funded procurement, is that the rule of thumb is efficiency. Procurement should be done focused on efficiency, low price, and no bid conditions that could unduly limit the pool, which means that state and local governments with federal funds have to ask for permission. A lot of confusion, and especially when there are desires to adopt other kinds of policies. Now, the Biden administration has done a lot of work to try to create more opportunity, and federal policy, in fact, has allowed for more opportunity and encouraged grantees to maximize the benefits. But the competition rule still exists. In the article, we recommend 2 actions to be taken by the federal government. One is the reissuance of a new, properly cited, correct Office of Legal Counsel opinion. And the second one, which is to revise federal grant rules, which we are very excited, and we'll talk later about. The Biden administration announced and showed a draft of on September 22nd, 2023, which is called Dollars Delivering Results. publishing these proposed updates to the Uniform Grants Guidance, which will eliminate things like the prohibition on geographic preferences and provide a lot more opportunity. We think this is a huge step forward and will result ultimately, hopefully, in the elimination of this gross misinterpretation of federal law. So I am going to end my slide presentation there, and I'm going to stop sharing. And I am now going to move on to our esteemed panel of eminent law professors who have been looking at this question of the definition of competition in federal law in many different ways. And we're very excited and proud to have you. I'm going to start with the primary author of this article, my partner, Professor Scott Cummings from UCLA, who is actually speaking to us from Italy. So thank you, Scott. And I want to, my first question is to help us understand better the kind of the origin of this through these Office of Legal Counsel opinions, the origin of this misinterpretation. So after reviewing the extensive legal history and legislative history and case law, what led you to the conclusion that the two Office of Legal Counsel opinions were incorrect?
Well, thank you. First, before I answer, I would like to personally thank Danielle and the law review team for all of their incredible support in helping us produce this article and to co-host this really important event. I think I'd answer the question by saying that it's important to treat these two Office of Legal Counsel opinions differently. The first, as Madeline has already really nicely laid out, was produced in 1986 during the Reagan administration, and the second in 2013 by the Obama OLC. So let me just give 2 points of context. First is about the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the OLC, it's a super important, very prestigious office in the Department of Justice that, among other things, provides legal opinions to various actors in the executive branch, like the Department of Transportation. And while their job is to provide independent legal advice on the legality of executive proposals, it is a political office, and its opinions have long carried large political consequences. The second context point that I want to provide before answering the question is that when we think about the history of the competition rule in federal procurement, for a long time, no one really thought of it in relation to state and local power. This was primarily because beginning in the 1950s with the first versions of the Federal Aid Highway Act, it was really about building interstate highways and enlisting states and cities as partners in that particular project. Then came the post-1960s transformation of cities by deindustrialization, so-called white flight, and economic decline. And many cities started to think about federal dollars coming in to build highways, helping to create the suburbs, and said, hey, wait a minute, how can we put this money to use for city residents, most of whom were low-income residents of color? So enter the 1986 OLC opinion. And we think when you look at this opinion, the problem is that it is primarily an ideological document. As Madeline has already suggested, it doesn't take this broader history into account. It doesn't look at the many ways in which federally funded procurement from the very beginning was designed precisely to promote broader socioeconomic goals, a broader socioeconomic return on the investment of federal dollars, promoting things like paying workers a prevailing wage, promoting equal opportunity for minority and women contractors, attending to the environmental impacts of highway production. All of these were considered to be completely compatible with the original idea of what the competition rule did. Instead, in the 1986 opinion, it really elevated the idea of the efficient use of federal funds as the cornerstone of the competition rule, stating that competitive bidding had to be read as a congressional judgment that the efficient use of federal funds afforded by competitive bidding is to be the, quote, overriding objective. So nothing else matter rather than efficiency. The case we make in a nutshell is that there was no textual basis for this efficiency idea, which was at the center of the broader law and economics effort to reshape the federal government, cut back on the use of federal funds, and now here stamping out local progressivism. We argue that this opinion misinterpreted the text and bootstrapped language about cost effectiveness applicable to the method, the procedures of bidding, as Madeline indicated, and really turning it into a cudgel to dismantle any substantive local bid requirements like the anti-apartheid certification in the New York City bid law. The 2013 opinion is a totally different document. It's careful, it's thorough, it engages with the history that the 1986 opinion totally glossed over. And as Madeline suggested, it ends up in a different place, rejecting the idea that cost effectiveness is the only criteria by which to judge transportation procurement, but ultimately not providing a lot of clear guidance in ways that has continued to chill local innovation. So even though it's better, we still think it makes some missteps that compromise its persuasive force, and it doesn't ultimately engage the fundamental issue of whether federal competition should in fact preempt state and local standards. I'll just highlight 3 quick points. First, the opinion, though it is trying to divorce itself from the 1986 precursor, really does continue to embrace the idea that competition is fundamentally about the, quote, efficient use of federal funds, without justifying the use of the efficiency term or really defining what it means, which creates a series of analytical problems that we spell out in the paper. Second, when the opinion does engage with the historical record, it emphasizes case law that supports the idea that substantive bid requirements are generally anti-competitive, but really glosses over other case law at the state level that go the other way. So as we show, most of the case law historically on competition really was about preventing procurement from being used to benefit insiders, what Madeline called anti-collusion, and not to prevent local policymaking that benefited local communities. And when the opinion does get to the heart of the matter, looking at cases that deal with bid specifications that promote social policy goals, the opinion essentially punts by stating that the case law reveals considerable disagreement over whether state and local governments have power to adopt social policies that are otherwise legal. So on the most important issue, the opinion sort of sidesteps a difficult question. And our point is that the case law actually provides more support to local innovation than the opinion lets on. And thus the opinion doesn't convincingly show that Congress intended to prevent this local experimentation. Finally, as mentioned, when the opinion does offer a standard, it provides very little concrete guidance, which continues to chill local innovation since cities do not want to test the waters and risk federal funds. So for these reasons, we suggest the opinion should be revisited.
Thanks so much, Scott. I do want to say I'm going to be asking questions of our panelists, but if either of you, Amy or Sabeel, want to comment on something that each of you has said, please feel free to do so. So before I ask Amy a question, is there anything either of you want to reflect on based on what Scott just said? Or I'll just jump in and we can keep it going. Okay, so I'm so proud and excited and honored to introduce Amy Kopinski, who's a professor of law, at the Yale University Law School, has written extensively on the issues related to competition law overall and the ideological drift and potential misinterpretation of multiple laws. And so, Amy, I'm wondering if you can contextualize the article for us and talk about how the purposeful misinterpretation of the definition of competition in federal procurement law reflects a broader pattern of manipulation of the law by the Borkian Chicago school conservatives.
Sure. And let me just begin by congratulating you two on this really superb article. I think it's a wonderful example of the importance of this kind of close analysis and also of this broader trend. So, you know, as you suggest, some of my work and what I think of more broadly as work in the law and political economy vein now has really done a lot to help us find and connect examples of the kind that you guys have so wonderfully drawn out here. And part of what we see is that there's a very broad way in which the conservative legal movement, which if you haven't read much about the conservative legal movement, one place to start is Steve Tellis's book, which really highlights the way that, foundation funding and so forth really elevated the conservative legal movement and law and economics within it. And so part of what you can put together by looking at those kinds of almost sociological accounts, but also the internal legal accounts of how law is changing across a number of areas, is that ideas that are borrowed from a particular kind of economics, let's say neoclassical economics, are moved into legal discourse, into law schools, and into policy. And this really, it gets consolidated around the time you guys are exactly identifying, right? This is, a phenomenon of the 80s, the 90s, but it continues in important ways, even through more progressive administrations, which is sort of what you're demonstrating, not always with exactly the same emphasis, but this is how you know a sort of a new paradigm has taken hold, is that, and so let me give you a couple of other examples where I think this has been beautifully illustrated. One is in the context of antitrust. Antitrust was actually the sort of first beachhead of the law and economics movement. Bob Bork, as you mentioned, famous to the public as a sort of supposedly originalist scholar who becomes borked in his Supreme Court hearing for his views on constitutional law, but famous in the academy first more for his views in some ways on antitrust law. And Bork was really at the forefront of the takeover of antitrust law with a very similar idea that antitrust law really fundamentally could be reorganized and should be rethought through the lens of competition and through the lens, actually even more specifically, of sort of the price effects of any particular move, let's say a merger. And that all really antitrust was sort of aiming at was lower prices for consumers effectively. And Bork, now I think wonderful articles by Cindric DePaul, for example, and others showing that was based really on a mistaken interpretation of the statute. And so I think shares a lot with you, right? You'd say there's a long statutory history of antitrust law. We have a lot of evidence, and think here of Cindric DePaul's work, Lena Khan's work, and others who've shown that there's an anti-monopoly tradition in American law. That antitrust law was not thought of in its inception as about something like driving prices to the lowest possible point, but rather about a means of structuring economic activity and economic coordination to ensure, for example, a balance of economic powers to try to generate the kind of economy that we wanted in a normative sense, one that would support a flourishing democracy and so forth. So this shift, the sort of elevation of a particular definition of efficiency, in effect, the kind of efficiency that antitrust law was after, has these kind of then ripple effects throughout the entire field of antitrust, making, for example, mergers much easier to approve and harder to oppose. But it also has all kinds of other effects, including on the ways that, for example, the claims of workers get written out of questions about competition, fair competition, and monopoly, and so forth. So there's been now, I think, through that scholarship, and very much what I hope we'll see through your scholarship, a real a shift in how people understand the mistakes that were made in this period, and are trying to then revive and update the old anti-monopoly ideas that really are at the heart of what these statutes are about, so that competition law can better serve, in fact, our collective interests, including the interests of workers, and address things like the political implications of businesses that are too big to fail or that have enormous governing power. We could talk more, too, about things like the rise of cost-benefit analysis, sort of technology at the heart of the regulatory state, introduced in a similar time period. I think many scholars would say, similarly, without any warrant in something affirmative that authorizes cost-benefit analysis, like congressional will, any constitutional basis, but instead, this is a technology. It sort of borrows from the language of economics, neoclassical economics. In fact, it's a very bastardized form of that thing that's really designed to defeat regulation, brought into the heart of the regulatory infrastructure with a particular definition of what kinds of costs and benefits will be considered, and that is carried through for many, many years and is used strategically over many years to defeat regulation. And again, I think scholarship of this kind, including some that Sabeel has been involved with across both scholarly and practical world, is, I think, helping to sort of challenge that view. And I could give you many other examples in the work that I do on intellectual property, for example. Ideas about efficiency came to really dominate the discussion of why we have laws. In fact, the very idea of intellectual property as opposed to copyright law and patent law really comes from a similar set of ideas about how competition and monopoly ought to work through this sort of neoclassical lens. And so we could probably lay many more examples on the table, but I think those are probably enough to at least give you and those of you watching a place to start to sort of find dots to connect to the broader trend that you're talking about.
I'd like to introduce Professor Sabeel Rahman from Cornell University, who also served the country and the Biden administration recently at the Office of Management and Budget, in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. And Sabeel, I just wonder, I mean, you have thought a lot about these same questions that Amy has brought up. I wonder if you have any reflections about this discussion. And I have some other follow-up questions, but I just wanted to give you a chance to jump in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Madeline. And thanks, Scott and Amy, too. And congratulations again on this piece. And I think there's a lot of amazing stuff already on the table. So let me just pick up from there. Part of what I really love, too, about this intervention that Scott and Madeline have offered is it really combines, right, that sort of kind of big picture, like, let's go back to first principles. What are we really trying to do when we're trying to build an equitable, inclusive, dynamic economy? And that's a much broader set of values that we're trying to realize than the narrow, like, kind of least cost approach where it was operationalized. And then connecting it to the regulations, which I know we'll talk about later in the webinar, because I think so much of the work in this moment to sort of reshape our economy in a more inclusive, equitable, dynamic way really needs both of these, right? It needs that big picture, sort of back to first principles, sort of deprogramming in a way some of these narrow understandings of the last few decades, but then connecting it to some of the really live opportunities that I think are really there and potentially transformative in public policy right now. So big congratulations to the paper. I think what I'd add is a couple of other sort of footnotes or riffs on what Scott and Amy have offered. One is, I think as part of this larger arc that both Scott and Amy described in how our thinking about the economy has evolved, has gone through twists and turns over the last century plus. Part of what I think is so interesting about that 19th century moment that you also unpack in the paper is when you think from a value standpoint, I think in a lot of ways, the central concerns for policymakers, reformers, activists, social movements at that time were very similar to some of the concerns now, right? We're concerns about rising corporate power, a concern about industrialization and how do we actually sort of regain control as we, the public, over these vast economic forces that are remaking our world, and a real concern about democratic political institutions, right? I think there was a real desire at that time to build institutions that were dedicated to the public interest that could then govern the economy with an eye towards the public interest. And that's why I think you get, on the one hand, new experiments in federal regulatory power, and importantly, that's also why you get home rule. And that's also why you get experiments in state and local institutions. And so I think when Scott talked about how state and local is often read out of these stories, that's such an important part to recapture, because I think what we're all trying to get at is A, a more inclusive economy, but B, the kind of democratic institutions through which we get a more inclusive economy. So that's kind of at a big picture level. I think in terms of the concrete proposals offered here, I think the other thing I would want to add is, in some ways, I think this things like the OLC memo and then the new proposed regulations, part of what's so powerful about these as legal intervention points is that we have sort of broad statutory, broad sort of public mandates to create, essentially a good, inclusive, dynamic economy. And where the rubber meets the road then is in these formulations of the legal standards, right? And I think the paper shows that the current standards really sort of came out of thin air. but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have standards, right? I think, to my mind, what that means is that we've just got the standard wrong, and we've got the standard wrong in a way that puts a thumb on the scale for a particular view of who benefits from the economy. So what we really ought to want, I think, as a larger sort of legal sort of movement and set of actors and reformers is thinking about really concretely what are those new regulations and standards that give a more holistic sense of public value, public impact, public good that we're trying to build towards. And I think the paper does that really beautifully.
Thank you so much. Amy, I want to go back to you. You've played a leadership role looking at how the right has misinterpreted a number of legal principles. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the law and political economy movement in challenging these misinterpretations?
Sure. So, I mean, broadly, I think of law and political economy as a sort of an emerging framework for analysis and scholarship, and as a community or a network of people. Many of them are writing on the Law and Political Economy blog. Be a good place to look for things related to topics you're interested in, because they really crisscross a wide variety of fields. And part of what we are trying to do, and there's a sort of small project that hosts the blog and also a number of events kind of like this one, and as well as scholarly conferences, is really revive an interest in law schools in political economy. I think the way we think about what political economy is that it's an acknowledgement. Putting those two words together is to acknowledge that the economy is constructed politically, and that it actually also can either facilitate and serve democratic values or can undermine them, and that a lot of the way that kind of the logic in debates in law schools and policy also proceeded over the last several decades was to kind of try to separate these two and say, well, the economy, that's this neutral thing that should be governed by values of efficiency, and then politics is something that happens over there where redistribution or other kinds of questions like justice ought to be addressed. But here, not over here in the economy. The economy is a machine, follows its own rules, and you have to leave it alone. Obviously, part of what you're describing in your paper in a great deal of detail, but that many of others of us do, working on everything from the carceral state to questions of immigration to questions of intellectual property and bankruptcy and banking, that in fact we construct the economy, and that the kind of economy that we build and sort of where we find the economy and how the economy comes to shape other institutions in our lives really is a matter of politics. And so broadly, we're working, I think, to sort of both understand the implications that followed from the conservative revolution that you talked about, but also, I think, very much back to Sabil's point, to sort of try to connect this to what a broader positive vision is. What do we want our economy to look like? What does a flourishing economy on a sustainable planet look like? What does a just economy look like? And then what can legal scholars and lawyers do to help facilitate that? And so that's very much what we're hoping to kind of help contribute to. And I also think, importantly, crisscrossing the world of advocacy and scholarship, because so much rich analysis comes out of the encounter precisely like the one you described this paper coming out of.
Thank you so much. Scott, I'm going to go back to you. And the historical interpretation of competition was codified under the pretense of maximizing efficiency and cost savings, as we've all been talking about. Does a reinterpretation of competition necessarily conflict with those goals of cost savings and efficiency?
I don't think so. One thing that we say in the article is that efficiency is a complicated and contested idea. And even if you take efficiency in a kind of narrow technical sense, and the 2013 OLC opinion does in fact say that substantive bid requirements that promote efficiency in the long run are okay. But even if you embrace a sort of narrow technical notion of efficiency, it isn't clear that it's inefficient to let cities do more, like hire workers at high enough wages to keep them happy and productive, to reduce turnover, to reduce their reliance on public benefits. As many companies are now embracing, the idea of efficiency should include environmental stewardship that sustains resources over time, that allows for profitability over the long term. So we both say that efficiency shouldn't be the only narrow efficiency, shouldn't be the only lens through which we judge procurement, but that even when we do, there are things cities should be able to do under the auspices of efficiency that they're currently disabled from doing based on the narrow reading of competition that we lay out in the paper. One of the things that the 2013 opinion says is in this regard is that project labor agreements, sort of collective agreements with labor unions in advance of these big projects that ensure labor peace may be long-term efficient and therefore okay under the competition rule because they avoid labor disruption, and that is economically efficient according to this interpretation. And this leaves open lots of other possibilities, again, sort of taking it at face value, like policies mandating health benefits to promote worker stability, or promoting local hiring of diverse workers to strengthen communities in which their businesses operate and to make them function in a more holistic way. And these can be framed as similarly efficient. So I think in the end, we really need to rethink what we want to get out of public investment, right? That's one of the big takeaways. As Sabeel, I think, beautifully put it, who benefits and who loses from public investment is sort of a core question that is unaddressed in the sort of formalistic interpretation of competition. We can still have these very rigorous bidding processes that are very careful about how money is spent, and very rigorous about the criteria used to evaluate bids, while still looking much more expansively at the public benefits that flow from it.
Thank you. Sabeel, I want to go back to you. So you've written extensively about the role of the administrative state, and actually you have participated in the administrative state in remaking social and economic systems. Can you elaborate on how the administrative state has been or can be used to combat structural economic disparities and social exclusions?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Madeline. I love that last point too that you just made, Scott. I mean, so I think like big picture, so I'm in law world for folks listening. I'm an administrative law guy, so of course I think about administrative agencies and institutions, and having spent some time in government recently. But I do think they're really central to this larger project, both for a historical reason and for a practical reason. Historically, I would argue that a big reason why we even have administrative agencies in the first place is to try to create this more just, inclusive economy. It's why the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is created in the first place, right? It's why when Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, it includes Title VI, which is very much a charge to federal agencies to use their authorities in a particular way towards a vision of civil rights and racial justice. So I think there's sort of like historical and legal sort of origin story about our administrative agencies in the first place. Then there's, I think, just like a very practical one, which is that, to make policy of this complexity that can adapt to changing conditions and meet the needs of the public, you're going to need an ability to sort of drill down to brass tacks. You're going to need, the ability to issue notices of funding opportunities and regulations and enforcement actions. But you're also, crucially, to the point of this discussion, you're going to need to be able to update those over time. And I think a big part of what it means to sort of have good government is to revisit and revise old interpretations and understandings to see, like, is this actually serving us, right? Is this serving the public interest? And I think, what we're talking about here is one really good specific example of that need. Just to make this concrete too, I think there's been a lot of good research over the last several years, Amy alluded to some of this too, about how our current crises of structural inequality, income inequality, chronic disparities on lines of race and gender and geography really owe a lot to poorly designed or intentionally poorly designed policies from the last few decades. When you look at, for example, wages and productivity splitting, right? Your productivity starts going up and wages become untethered to productivity growth at a macro level. That has to do with a lot of policies of the kind that we're talking about here. And so there's like a very concrete connection that I would argue that, regulations on everything from corporate law and sort of regulations on finance to the kinds of regulations we're talking about here to sort of labor and workplace regulations and civil rights regulations all play a role in, constructing the economy as we experience it.
Great, thank you. A lot to think about and exciting ways. Amy, I want to go back to you. So many have stated that the Biden administration's priority signal a return to industrial policy. And that is something that JMA has been very involved in as well. And obviously this is an exciting moment, and it's also a moment of potential opportunity and danger. So how should we understand, from your perspective, the term industrial policy, and what are the values and practices that should be associated with it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So, you throw a stick at a policy journal in Washington and it will tell you that industrial policy is back. It's everywhere, right? And so it's, of course, understood to be a sort of fundamental move of the Biden administration to talk about industrial strategy again, or industrial policy. But there's also sort of a more, broader bipartisan return to industrial policy. And I think it's helpful to take a step back, as Sabile was encouraging us to earlier to do, and sort of say, what's going on here? Why is this happening? I think broadly, obviously, we all saw and lived through in COVID the incredible fragility of the kind of just-in-time, just-in-time supply chains, for example, the degradation of our infrastructure, governmental infrastructure, also the public health infrastructure. And obviously, since the financial crisis and beyond, with the kind of, stagnant wages and rising inequality and so forth that we've seen, there's a real sense that I think our economy, the economy built by neoliberalism, or the economy built by this sort of ideas of neoclassical economics written into policy that we got in the 80s up until very recently, I think, really helped generate kinds of fragility, instability, and unfairness, and concentrated power in the economy. And there's a return to industrial policies in attempts to rectify that. And I think it makes quite a lot of sense in that register to think, well, now, we should do something called industrial policy. So what is industrial policy? In the thinking and writing that I've done about this, I have started to think about industrial policy really as deliberate attempts to shape different sectors of the economy according to public aims. And I think what's important about a definition that has all of those qualities, right, that it's an attempt to shape sectors of the economy to meet public aims, is that it does a couple of things to distinguish, I think, what we could be and should be doing now in our economic thinking from what really dominated over the past several decades. So thinking sectorally, thinking what kind of energy sector do we need to have? What kind of care sector do we need to have? That's logical, both because our world of institutions is actually organized sectorally, right? And this kind of problems that emerge in the energy sector are a little bit different than the problems that emerge in the care sector. And I think it's really important to resist what we saw in sort of economic policy speak over the last several decades, which was sort of some idea that like everything should be done through price signals, and we have to like commensurate everything through the great equilibrating machine of, supply and demand. And so like, you just can't think, you can't just think about prices, don't think about jobs, don't think about, forget it. Like trade is going to be organized by competitive, advantage, and no longer have to worry about whether anybody has jobs anymore. We're just going to think about like, these very sort of spare sort of supply and demand curves. I think that clearly has taken us in the wrong direction. And so what we need to do is actually embrace the idea of thinking sectorally. I think it's also really important to say we're not thinking about industry, right? Because the American economy is not an industrial economy. It also has a vast role for services. And so we don't want whatever industrial policy is, this kind of catchy name that obviously has been around for a long time. The point is to actually be able to build the economy we want. Right. And so that has to include, I think we should think sectorally, but not about manufacturing per se, because the care sector or the services sector, those are big players. And I think very broadly, we have to think about industrial policy as about the attempt to do this to meet public aims, because what we might otherwise get is, in the guise of industrial policy, the same thing you guys are talking about with respect to this competition rule, which is the elevation of a particular criteria like efficiency to say, well, if we're going to do green energy, I guess we better do it the cheapest way possible. Or if we're going to build the care sector, we better do it the cheapest way possible, with focusing on sort of one criteria. I think an overly narrow one, Scott, your point, we can all kinds of ways in which we want to be efficient, but that particular technical version that's being used often in that discourse is really, I think, problematic. And so I think what we want to do is sort of broaden the aperture and say, in our policy making, there are a lot of goals we have for the economy, and industrial policy legitimately can aim at good jobs. It can aim at raising the pay of many occupations that pay poverty level wages now in the United States. It can aim at a sustainable environment, and in fact, this is inherent in the idea of industrial policy to begin with, which is often talked about, I would say, somewhat problematically through the lens of, say, national competitiveness. But already we're outside the register of simple efficiency. We know we have goals like environmental sustainability, and so we ought to embrace that and think about what kinds of goals ordinary people have for the economy and set those as the things we desire in industrial policy, and then try to build. And I would say, like, two other things just to add briefly about where we might go. What should we be trying to do with industrial policy beyond just generally setting public aims, achieving public aims, and working sectorally? Oh, I'll just add two other things. One is that I think we really do need to be thinking about how to rebuild administrative capacity and power to sort of actually execute good programs. I mean, the public has a right to want effective government, and I think seen that we really need to do some rebuilding work to make sure that, in fact, we have the information and the knowledge and the capacity in government to actually achieve these kinds of things, like rebuilding our energy infrastructure. And the second piece is, I think we should really be thinking about building industrial policy through the lens of building the building power of workers, of communities of color, and thinking about this through the lens of what we sometimes in the scholarly world call countervailing power. Industrial policy has the risk of really empowering industry, billions and billions of dollars going, let's say, to the semiconductor industry. So at the same time as we may be leveraging certain kinds of government investment to try to build semiconductors or build green energy, we have to be very deliberate about also building power in organized constituents of society that otherwise won't have a lot of say over how administration works and won't be able to contest the power of these private entities everywhere from local government back up to the state government, and insist that values like good jobs can actually be compatible with these broad public investments that we want, and in fact should really be an essential part of it.
Sabine, I want to go
Yeah.
to you, because I could feel that. You've written a lot about countervailing power and how the administrative state has fueled that. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on how the administrative state can turn that around.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm really glad Amy sort of kind of connected the dots the way she just did, because I think this is hugely important for like the next, say, 5, 10, even more years of learning and development on public policy, is how do we actually do this, right? And I think one of the, so I'll come back to your question, Madeline, but just to say, I think one of the real energizing, exciting possibilities of the policy changes that are being proposed, of the vision sketched out in y'all's paper, is that I actually think we need to try a bunch of things to learn by doing on what exactly are the right ways to try to weave in, requirements for prevailing wage, or equity considerations, or a seat at the table for local communities who might otherwise be sort of literally bulldozed over, with new infrastructure projects, but for, having actually a say in how these decisions are made. I think we have some ideas, but I actually think we need to just roll up our sleeves and start doing it. And the learning possibility for us as a country, if we're able to sort of unlock the capacities of local governments to actually then go forth and try different ways of meeting this more holistic vision of efficiency, or this more holistic vision of the public good, in the way that these proposals in the paper might hopefully unlock, I think is hugely underrated. And I would argue that part of good government is not just a broader view of efficiency and what is good, sort of to what Scott and Amy were saying, but also a broader view of what it takes to learn how to do government better, right? That's part of what we're investing in as a public, I think, right? And so we actually want to try a bunch of things. So all of which is to say, this idea of countervailing power and sort of actually including some seat at the table for communities and some guardrails, I think there are a lot of ways that it can be done. You're starting to see some of these experiments. So Scott mentioned, the kind of rich experience with project labor agreements. I know Scott and others have been have played a central hand in a lot of that work, and you too, Madeline. I think those are really important lessons to learn. I think we've seen some newer experiments too. For example, some of the industrial policy funding streams that the Biden administration has put forward in the last year or so include things like some of the CHIPS ones included a limitation on stock buybacks, for example. And one of the challenges for industrial policy is how do we keep all those dollars from just flowing straight to investors' pockets instead of flowing into communities and into the real economy. That early returns, early data on that, I think is positive about the impacts of that. So in terms of how we would do it, I think of it as one, including some guardrails, right? Those might be labor standards guardrails. Those might be examples like the buyback restriction, and then some creating some hooks and levers for communities. So what are the forums that communities can participate in to help shape and channel the flow of resources and investments, or to monitor potential violations of those guardrails, right? I think that's another sort of underappreciated form of community participation in sort of auditing or voicing, being the early warning signs of hey, we were supposed to get a certain wage level, or we were supposed to get a certain type of investment in our community, and we're not seeing it. But you can voice that before the project is done and all the dollars are spent.
Scott, I want to go back to you. So assuming we can take off the kind of burden of this old definition or misinterpretation of the competition rule on public procurement, including procurement by state and local governments that receive federal grants, how could that fit into this reimagined idea of industrial policy and economic prosperity? Scott, you're muted.
Never quite get used to that. I was saying that this is the point where I would like to exercise a prerogative to turn the question back on the moderator, which maybe I'll do at the end, because just building on some of the great points that Amy and Sabeel have made around kind of thinking about how to shape sectors to serve public aims. Really, as Sabeel noted, ensuring that there's accountability for the expenditure of public funds, and that the folks who benefit from those expenditures are actually the ones that the funds are designed to help the most on the ground. Madeline obviously has pioneered this work in LA and now nationally, and so I think her vision really is stamped onto the article, and I think adding to the conversation would be helpful. I think one way that I think about this, just from a historical perspective and connecting back to the paper, is that, as I mentioned before, sort of conflict over procurement really came out of the deindustrialization moment, when cities were trying to figure out, after industry had left, where they could get resources that could be leveraged. And lots of the fights around procurement kind of grew out of that particular moment, when cities tried to build good jobs, use money to hire locally, support unions. And this was really part of the background reasoning that motivated, I think, the federal government to crack down in the OLC opinion, although it's not explicit in that particular opinion. I think it's operating in the background. It's an important part of the story. So, the paper is sort of, we make these two arguments about what sort of administrative reform could do to kind of reverse this particular trend. And there's a lot of money on the table that can be directed to good companies to produce transit infrastructure that serves local communities, but also rebuilds manufacturing jobs that are good jobs and pay high wages and have unions representing workers and giving them voice in the workplace. And this is about building buses, subways, cars, electrical vehicles that really are going to be the heart of the transit infrastructure and are being funded by a lot of the policies that we've already discussed. So there's so much potential, I think, in this federally funded procurement arena, particularly now, that could be unlocked with these changes. I think it's just sort of removing the barriers that then will allow a lot of the experimentation that Sabeel spoke so eloquently about to flourish, and to try to think about what actually works and what doesn't work. So we give some ideas in the paper. We're sort of excited about removing the restriction on geographic preferences to permit local hiring and local sourcing requirements that can really go a far way in rebuilding good manufacturing jobs for workers who need them most, and linking the federal funds to the production of high-paying industry jobs and jobs that promote environmental sustainability. We give some concrete ideas, the sort of use of the sort of U.S. jobs plan, which is sort of a scoring mechanism that gives points to bidders based on sort of a set of holistic criteria that include: are you providing good jobs? Are you engaged in hiring practices that promote racial equity? Are you engaged in good environmental practices addressing climate change? Again, with the idea, I think the big idea being that all of this is important to kind of rethinking what the best social return on the investment of the public funds should be, and everyone has a stake in that and should be at the table in defining it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And we have about 1 minute left, so I will just add on. I think that we really are at this moment, and Amy really described, that our economy is, it's got a lot of bad jobs and a lot of different sectors, and our economy is very sectorally based, and competition in the more colloquial definition of it really is based on sectors. So a sectoral approach really does make sense. But if we think about this massive investment through the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, and to some degree the bipartisan infrastructure law, in this transition to clean technology and high technology and all of the hardware that's being produced, it's not a given that these are going to be good jobs. We have to make them good jobs, or we have to incentivize them into being good jobs. It is certainly not a given that everyone in communities who have been historically marginalized or currently marginalized are going to have an opportunity for those jobs. And it's not a given that clean technology is going to not cause harm. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The processing of these precious minerals and making of things like batteries cause tremendous harms on surrounding communities. So we have this moment in the formulation of industrial policy that Amy has suggested and Sabeel and Scott have talked about, where if we lift off the burden or like this ridiculous, unnecessary oversight by the federal government over how procurement is done by grantees, and we say your job is to maximize benefits. So we want the win-win-wins everywhere. And so how do we create the win-win-wins? We add in direct incentives. We add in something that the Department of Energy is doing, which is called community benefits plans, something we refer to as community benefits agreements. We create infrastructure, especially in places like the South, where at least 50% of these new factories are going. Then we can really see a whole new industrial revolution, and that is really reflecting our values of fairness and democracy. So I am going to close out the panel, the formal panel, and open it up for questions. And my colleague, I don't know if you introduced yourself as legal director of Jobs to Move America, but is building our program, and actually significantly contributed to making sure that we were dotting every I and crossing every T in this long article. So I'm going to turn it back to Melanie Prasad.
Thanks so much, Madeline. And Amy, I know that you have to hop off soon, so please feel free to do that when the time comes. Madeline, we were hoping to keep you on for the audience questions. Thanks. So this first question is that experimentation in the administrative state sounds great, but implies that there will be failures as well as successes. The epithet of Solyndra teaches us that the administrative state has no room for error. How can we begin to change the public's perception of agencies to permit for that?
I think that's Sabine.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm happy to jump in, but I'm actually really curious, Madeline and Scott, your take on this too. And thanks, James, for the question. So I know many folks, including folks on the Zoom, have been thinking about this. I'd say a couple of things. I think one is that the sort of like zero room for failure is actually one of the ways that the sort of larger political economic consensus on the sort of narrow old vision of efficiency is perpetuated, right? So that sense that agencies, or for that matter, localities, are going to pay a legal or political price for trying something that maybe doesn't work perfectly. That's some of the enforcement mechanism that keeps in place these old legal opinions, right? Because that fear gets internalized. And so it's a really important question. I think there are a couple ways that we can get at this. One is that I think there's a value to just like trying a bunch of things, and where there is political will and sort of favorable elected leadership and appointed leadership at the local level or nationally, just like changing the facts on the ground by showing different proof points, I think is hugely valuable. A second is, I think we do need to change the larger public conversation. So there is a version of this that is not a sort of policy wonk conversation, but that I think really does need to be a public conversation about what do we, the public, what ought we to demand of our government when we want our government to work effectively? It's not actually cost effectiveness in a narrow sense. It's I see good wages and I see good, I see good sort of a good economy in my local sort of in my local experience, right? And so I think there's a public narrative piece to this. And I think I, as an admin and con law guy, I'd be remiss if I didn't say there's a version of this that is going to require a different conversation around the courts, right? I think a big part of why we have that sort of internalized sense of like no room for error is because of a sort of decades of pretty hostile judicial opinion on a whole range of administrative issues, particularly those that are focused on economic and racial and gender equity of various kinds. And so we're just going to have to, have that conversation. That's a different conversation than this one, but I'll just bookmark it here.
Just to add one thing, even for conservatives, there are, I think, some genuine conservatives who would like to promote more entrepreneurship, for example. And there have been a lot of limitations because of this, extensive restriction on the ability to promote local businesses and a diversity of entrepreneurship. And I think for more conservative cities or, everyone, now there would be, with these changes, an ability to experiment with that. How do you both provide support, technical assistance for local businesses, and then how do you actually give them a leg up in public procurement with this massive investment?
The only thing I would add is just, they think that there are lots of things that agencies already do well or could do well if they were permitted to do so. And so part of the conversation also has to be how to get the message out, particularly in such a highly fractured and polarized world where even when agencies do good stuff, that stuff doesn't always get translated in the public domain in ways that can be consumed and appreciated by people on a large scale. And so I think it isn't just, as Sabine put very well, that there is no room for error. There's also lots of stuff that aren't error prone that are happening that really need to be publicized in ways that change the public consumption of this information.
For that. So the next question is regarding how a new OLC opinion could or couldn't impact cities challenged by abusive state preemption. And so the example that was given was, for example, how would cities in states that currently prohibit the use of project labor agreements sort of be affected?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So could you restate it? Sorry.
Sorry, that's probably my fault for trying to half repeat, half rephrase the question. So I believe the question is around sort of city versus state preemption as it relates to competition. So things that that might be allowed with the updates to the uniform guidance and sort of be where cities and states would be given permissive authority to do certain things. I think the question is around if a new OLC opinion could help in instances where a city is authorized to do something, but currently there's a state law preempting it.
Got it. That's a really great question and highlights the multiple problems of preemption, both at the federal and state level. I think our article is focused exclusively on this stealth federal preemption through the competition rule that disables what would otherwise be legal action by cities under state law, right? And so the piece where we go through the 2013 OLC opinion is really about saying, hey, there's a parallel universe of state competition law that actually, in many ways, is much more favorable to city innovation than what the federal procurement law and the federal competition rule will allow. And so if you get rid of this restrictive federal rule, then cities can do a bunch of stuff that they would not otherwise be able to do. And that's going to be better for local communities. Our rule would not touch the state-city relationship. And so the questioner is correct to say that providing flexibility for cities to do stuff would not address the problem where you have the red states, blue cities, where red states set these broad preemption rules that then disable local action. That's a separate problem. And it's a very, very difficult problem. It's not a problem that an OLC opinion could address. It relates to issues of home rule that Sabeel raised earlier. And it has to, this sort of issue has to, I think, be fought on multiple fronts in parallel to one another. And this is an area of building out home rule and really giving cities more protection against overreaching state preemption that would then fortify the competition revision that we're proposing.
I'll just say one possible area for exploration comes through the reissue these new OMB rules around the acceptable and to some degree required use of federal grant money by cities. And the question is really about how those rules are written and whether there's a supremacy clause intervention that where potentially a federal requirement or even authorization could allow a city to fight back against a state preemption. So I think that would be an area for exploration using the supremacy clause arguments. So I do think that once we have the final and the uniform guidance, that there could be an opportunity to look into a supremacy clause challenge by a city wanting to do policy in a state where that policy is preemptive.
Great, thank you for that. So this next question, I believe, is about local governments that have sort of adopted this view that competition only means sort of maximizing number of bidders, efficiency, lowest costs, if you guys have suggestions on thoughts on sort of how to change this sort of mentality, even if hopefully the uniform guidance updates do end up going through and like the interpretation of competition is changed, what sort of can be done to shift this perception at the local level?
Honestly, I think we've got to do a whole lot of organizing in our legal community. So we've got to do more than one webinar. We have to, once there's a new set of rules, and I think, you know, a lot depends on what happens the election next year. This current OMB has, and it's the Office of Federal Financial, OFF, Office of Federal Management, Office of Federal, thank you, Seville, of the current leadership of the OFFM has said that they really want to do a whole program around local education, state and local education, or what they call grantee education. And I think it's going to be up to the legal community to a great extent to work with our colleagues in city attorney's office and state attorney's offices at, you know, or agency attorneys across the country to shift the mentality to from can't do to can do. And that's a factor of organizing, it's a factor of education, but it is going to be a lot of hard work to shift the can't do, to shift away from the can't do attitude. And Sibyl, you thought a lot about the same issue, so you may have more.
No, I'll just quickly, I mean, I love this question and your answer, Madeline. I mean, I totally agree with what Madeline said. And maybe this is a slightly optimistic take, but I would say even independent of whatever, you know, wild things may or may not come our way as a country over the next year, I would say that, you know, these shifts in mentality around policy, political economy, they do take years, if not decades, right, to build and grow and flourish. And historically, at least, that has often been the case. It's been sort of like a bumpy, but still a through line, despite sort of like macro level, you know, changes in administration. And so I do think I'd be really interested to sort of think about, you know, how to catalyze and sustain those types of conversations. You know, one thing that we thought a lot about is how to use, for example, in context of the equity work, how to use some of that as a sort of a way to crowd in new ideas from state and local governments. I'd also think about the pipeline piece. You know, I'm sure you see this a ton, but I've just been so continually amazed and impressed by how many sort of young lawyers, advocates, activists are newly energized and engaged on a lot of these questions around equity, political economy, power, local economic development. And I think we could do as a legal profession a much better job at helping people sort of connect up to, you know, roles in government, roles in advocacy. You know, I just think there's a lot of raw energy out there that just needs a little bit more sort of matchmaking and connecting of the dots. And I mean, that's all organizing, right? As you said, Madeline, of different kinds. But I'm optimistic about what we could do coming out of this window.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Scott, Sabile, Madeline, also Amy, who had to leave early, for sharing all of your wisdom with us and for this wonderful discussion. I want to turn it over now to JMA's Deputy Director, Brandon Nelson, who has been leading a lot of our work at the federal level to talk about the updates to the uniform guidance.
Well, Sabile said that we have a lot of organizing work to do. So this is where I try to organize you all. So I think that's my job. So as we've been discussing, the Office of Management and Budget, their Office of Federal Financial Management, recently put out a new proposed uniform guidance, which includes many of the updates that Madeline and Scott and the other panelists think would be good. So this is super exciting. The guidance, this version of the guidance removes the ban on geographic preferences so that cities and states can hire locally and source locally. It also adds in permission to put in place a variety of pro-worker and pro-equity measures like project labor agreements, local and targeted hiring, taking job quality into account when contracting, and several others. So this is very exciting. I want to organize you all to submit some positive comments, telling the administration that we think that this is a great idea. So a few options for that. If you would like, this is where you can submit a comment yourself. So I just dropped that link in the chat. We also have, JMA has been part of a coalition working to update this guidance, and our coalition has put together comments for members of the coalition and any other supporters who would like to sign on. So I dropped that in the chat as well. And if you're a little curious about what the various updates were that we're super excited about, I can share that as well. So I will, that one, it looks like I have to upload, which is annoying. We'll share that out when we share whatever we're sharing after this, right, Melanie? Can we do that?
Just going to chime in to say that
Perfect.
send along a link to the recording, and also we'll include relevant materials following up after the webinar.
Perfect. So it would be incredibly helpful if you all might think about commenting and encouraging the administration in these efforts.
You want to talk about the timeline?
Oh, yes, and the deadline. These comments are due December 4th. So if you can sign on to if you're interested in signing on to our comments, we're hoping to get that done a little bit sooner than that. We would feel better if you signed on sooner, but if you want to submit your own, you have until December 4th.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Well, probably in a webinar first, it looks like we are going to finish just a little bit early. I want to again thank our amazing panelists, our moderator, everyone who contributed to this webinar, UCLA Law Review, and thank everyone for attending. As I said earlier, we will have the webinar up on our website later this week, and we'll also be sending a follow-up email with a lot of relevant information, links, the documents that Miranda mentioned. So you'll be receiving that shortly. So thank you so much, everyone.